Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey, folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List. I'm Rick Wilson, and my guest today is former FBI Director James Comey. He is a guy who has been around the block in the news for the last few years for many, many reasons during the very tumultuous era of Donald Trump's first term. But he has had a second act in life, and I think we all should have a second act in life, maybe a third, as a novelist with a cracking new mystery novel called Westport. I have pneumonia right now, and I read it over the weekend and enjoyed the hell out of it. And so, Jim Comey, welcome to the Enemies List. We'll talk about the book for a few minutes. And I did note, you spent some time out working in a hedge fund out at Bridgewater, and there are some things about this novel that are reminiscent of that kind of environment. Talk to us about how you got inspired to write this novel, and which is your second, and tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you. I love what you do. I was reluctant to write fiction after I wrote nonfiction immediately after getting fired, and was kind of pushed into it, nudged into it by my editors, and because they said, "Look, you write narratives well, you write dialogue well," and I said, "Yeah, I don't like making stuff up." But they convinced me that I could take people inside of places I've been through fiction in a way that you can't in nonfiction. And so I wrote the first one, which was centered in the law enforcement environment in New York, Central Park West. And the second one is inspired by, I mean, obviously it's not a secret history of the hedge fund I worked at, but I felt like I could capture the spirit of a hedge fund and tell a pretty good whodunit story that people might enjoy this summer. And so I took my protagonist, a former federal prosecutor, and I had her move to work at a hedge fund and get in serious trouble. And I've got the third one in the works. The third one will come out next year, which is focused on white identity extremism, domestic violence back in New York. So I'm enjoying telling stories from places I've been.
Well, I have not read your first novel, for full confession, but having read this, I will say this, and you do have a surprisingly good dialogue and narrative pace through the book, and I enjoyed that a lot. And it did feel like you were getting an insight into the sort of the characters inside that hedge fund world and the sort of dynamics that play out. And while it wasn't radialo, you could tell the bridge. You could tell you'd had some experience into that world of how the tensions play out inside that space.
Yeah, I hope so. And because I was there for 3 years before I left to teach at Columbia, and then I had the opportunity to be the FBI director until I got fired. But it was, and so what I've tried to do is, they tell me, write what you know. And so I've done mob cases, I've done political corruption cases, I've worked in a big hedge fund. And so, as I said, it's not the real people because it's fiction, but I hope some of the spirit, some of the tension inherent in an environment like that is captured.
I've done some work as a consultant on the outside for private equity folks. And so it definitely had the ring of like that environment is so competitive internally in ways that I don't think a lot of people outside of private equity and hedge funds and the money world understand. So wanted to praise you on that. But yeah, we are living in not only in the novel world, but we are living in a world where sometimes the truth is more colorful and lurid than the fiction. I wanted to get your opinion on the trial that's eating America right now, the Donald Trump corruption case in New York, and get your feelings on how that's playing out.
Yeah. And if you wrote a proposal for a novel based on a former president like Donald Trump and a hush fund, porn star, sex trial, they'd say, yeah.
Okay. Two on the nose.
Go crazy.
Right.
So yeah, I've followed it, and I've been impressed by the work the DA's office has done. I Obviously, I read the indictment when it first came out, and I think their case has exceeded at least my expectations in the way they put it together. Methodically, a case not susceptible to cross-examination based on documents, based on emails and texts and the defendant's own words, really well put together, and then capped off with the testimony of the cooperator Cohen. And so I've been surprised to the upside. I've tried a lot of cases to juries, so it's always dangerous, even when you're in the courtroom, to prognosticate. But I've told my family I would bet an 80% chance of conviction, 20% of a hung jury, and I'd put 0% chance of acquittal.
Wow. Okay. It does strike me as that I'm not an attorney, but I've watched how, interspersed with Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, there are an awful lot of and here's the check that was written on this day, and the accountants and the mechanical parts of the process that make it harder for the defense to say, oh, Michael Cohen's a liar, Stormy Daniels is a porn star, you can't trust them. But they've seen an awful lot on that jury, I think, of the mechanical elements that went into this particular action and the paper trail. I mean, that strikes me as something that is undercounted in a lot of these things around Donald Trump, is there really is a paper trail. There's a paper trail in the documents case, whether we'll ever get to that case or not with Judge Cannon. There's a paper trail in this case. There's a paper trail in the election cases in Georgia and Arizona. And it strikes me that these guys were not the most diligent kind of conspirators in any of these things. There always seems to be a big mess of documents and emails and meeting notes and everything else that sort of does the work of the prosecutors for them.
Yeah. And despite Trump aspiring to be a modern day Stringer Bell, yelling at one of his underlings for taking notes during a criminal conspiracy, there are lots of notes taken. And that's where the prosecutors have done a great job. Brick by brick, they let the jury see this is what Donald Trump's world was like. This is how he managed. This is who he worked for. This is how they communicated. This was his MO over and over again. So you almost got to a point, I'll bet they had meetings about whether to even call Cohen, because they'd gotten to a place where, of course, Donald Trump knew what was going on. There's no way Weisselberg approved something like this without the boss knowing. It's a Cosa Nostra family. Of course he knew. And so it was a very impressive job of putting it together. You never know with a jury, but like I said, I would think either conviction or a hung jury are the two possible results.
You know, from the beginning, my feeling on this is that the court cases aren't going to change the political environment as much as people on the left would hope, and they're not going to elevate Trump as much as people on the right would hope. But I do think, I think that two of the other cases out there, they really speak to something I think you saw up close, and that's the election case and the documents case. That Donald Trump represented a really unique, sui generis kind of threat to American institutions and norms and the rule of law. Where do you see those two cases ending up? I mean, I feel like both of them have kind of been derailed technically. But where do you see those two cases headed?
I see those two cases not being tried before the election. Yeah. And I should say, by the way, about the Manhattan case, I think it is a great civics lesson for America. I think people are paying attention. This is how it works. This is what the rule of law looks like. Right. This is a demonstration that no one is above that. You may not lose supporters if you shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue, but you will be held accountable. And this is what it looks like. You sit at a table. You don't mouth off. Your lawyer gets to speak. The prosecutors speak. It goes back and forth. There are rules and procedures. That rule of law is really what the next election is about. And it's great to have people shown the way it works. I don't think we'll get to see that even without cameras. We won't get to see it in the federal system in either of those cases. The documents case is obviously the overwhelmingly most strong case against Trump. Sure. But I don't expect that to be tried before the election, nor the January 6th case. Now, well, people have whipped up on the Supreme Court. I actually take a slightly different view. I think they have to answer a really important question. Of course, the president doesn't get absolute immunity. That's easy. The president surely gets some immunity, and Joe Biden loses in November. It's going to be an important thing. And so the Supreme Court, I think, has to say, no, here's the scope of immunity. Here's the test for it. Right. And that's not an easy thing to do. That's why they're taking a little longer than folks might want.
It is, yeah, no, and I think that's right. I think that immunity question is incredibly consequential. I think it's enormously important, and not, and I don't think that the court is poised to wipe away any accountability by the president. I think that Trump folks primarily went at that as a delaying tactic. I think they primarily went at this as a way to run out the clock on the Jack Smith and the documents case, in a large measure.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, even Jack Smith's lawyer, Michael Dreeben, arguing in the court, basically conceded that the D.C. Circuit, in its decision saying Trump gets no absolute immunity, had gone too far, and said, in substance, there is no immunity whatsoever against criminal prosecution. And that can't be right. And so there has to be some scope drawn for the immunity a president's entitled to when he leaves office.
Yeah, and inside the four corners of the official duties of the president, I mean, that's been a long-held sort of norm that you don't want civil and criminal prosecutions fired off at random from state attorneys general or anything else on things that are legitimate and legal actions of the president. So I think it's a really, that to me really is one of the most, I hope will be one of the most meritorious things to come out of this, is that we will see, and as a conservative, as a guy who believes that executive power is bounded under the Constitution and the intent of the founders, I don't want to see any president, Republican or Democrat, with unlimited scope of authority. That's a very unsmall d democratic, un-American outcome in my view. But
I agree very much. And on the other side, I think it's really important that a president be protected when he is exercising, or she someday, God willing, is exercising authorities at the core of their constitutional responsibilities, that they have a certain measure of protection from second guessing in the form of civil or criminal exposure later.
Right. And I mean, the criminal, the civil stuff has long been pretty much buttoned down, but the criminal, and I worry that we will enter into a phase where attorneys general in the states, who are now increasingly in a politicized frame, and I mean that on both sides of the equation. I'm not both sidesing this, but there really are activist attorney generals on both sides of the equation now, would start to look at that as a political strategic way to elevate themselves. That does worry me in both directions. So I wanted to ask you something, because you were at the center of a lot of the tension between Donald Trump and the FBI and the Department of Justice. And like a lot of people who are engaged in shady activity, he really didn't like having the DOJ and the FBI do their jobs. What are some lessons that you drew out of that era about the importance of the DOJ's independence, the role of the FBI, the scope of their interaction in political matters or tangentially political matters? What are some of the lessons you drew out of that period?
Really, they're the lessons that we drew as a nation after Watergate, that we had to both recognize that the investigative and prosecutive authority sits within the executive branch and so is answerable to the president, but that it must in some way be spiritually, culturally separate from the political control, right? The 10-year term that I was given in 2013 was largely symbolic, right? I knew the president could terminate that term at any time.
Sure.
Or I could leave if I wanted to, but it was a message that Congress sent after Watergate that said, no, we want to send a message that you, the FBI director, are in the executive branch, but can't ever be entirely of the executive branch. So we want a certain tension there and distance. And it's not easy to define that ambiguity, that tension, but it's important to maintain. I mean, Donald Trump tried to end it by hugging me, I guess literally at one point, hugging me in, so that there was no difference between my role and the role in the White House chief of staff or the head of his campaign. And that's a mistake we made long ago, and we determined not to make again. The prosecutive investigative authority, because it's going to have to touch interests close to those in power, has to be separate, so that, not entirely separate, I believe in leaving it, there's some tension there, but so the American people can be reassured the system is fair. Decisions are being made based on the facts, right? Whatever the wingnuts on the right say about the Biden Justice Department, right now, not far from where I'm sitting, Robert Menendez is on trial for corruption.
Right.
have to be able to go after the powerful in a way the American people would say, okay, that's just.
Henry Cuellar down in Texas, another Democrat. I mean, it doesn't look like they're stacking the deck in the Biden world against or just going after Republicans. They certainly and rightly. I mean, public corruption is the ultimate corrosive, I think, element in a society, because once you have publicly corrupt officials who consistently think they can get away with everything they want, and it's the stuff that it's why we have members of Congress who say, "Oh, insider trading is fine if I do it, but it's a crime if Martha Stewart does it."
Yep. Well, and it's one of the reasons that the FBI has no friends in high places.
Right.
J. Edgar Hoover for 50 years cultivated relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And famously, when Lyndon Johnson was urged to get rid of him, he said, "I'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in." Well, the message after Watergate was, don't go anywhere near the tent. Stay out of the tent.
Right.
So if you're a member of Congress, I don't care what party you're in, you can't trust the FBI in the political sense, because they're just going to find the facts. And if the facts are bad for you, you're screwed. And so Bureau shouldn't have friends in high places, but in a way, its independence is a recipe for not having friends in high places when a storm hits.
So let me ask you to cast your mind forward a little bit in what I like to think of as a very bad scenario. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, because one of the things I've noticed on the right is that Donald Trump and a lot of that MAGA media world, whether it's Fox or Steve Bannon or OAN or Newsmax, they've tried to turn the FBI and the entire intelligence apparatus, aside from the FBI, into this sort of demonic, dark force in our society where they, if Trump is reelected, he's going to feel like he has the political cover to quote unquote reform the deep state and tear it down and all these things. Explain to Americans what happens if we end up with a politicized FBI that works for Donald Trump in a second term, and what it means for the jobs they're supposed to be doing versus what they'll probably end up doing.
Well, you can just study history to see what that will look like. If the FBI bows to the president's will, then its extraordinary investigative authority can be directed not based on the facts that justify opening an investigation and the development of probable cause and then enough evidence to bring charges, but instead will return to the bad old days of targeting people with that incredible power based on political interest. And then we depict Lady Justice in this country always with a blindfold, because we don't want her peeking out to pick favorites. We want her to weigh equally without regard to persons. Well, you'll have the mask lifted up, maybe even ripped off, and you can no longer trust that justice is just. That is a corrosive place to be, an enormous mistake. We would recover from it. I believe in the resilience of America, but it would do us damage that would take years to undo. Again, we've lived this history. I was the seventh director of the FBI. The five before me, so the six total after Hoover, were all people, not a Democrat among them, by the way. We're talking about the lefty FBI. Not one of us is an appointed FBI director who was not identified as a Republican beforehand. And if you know the FBI, you know it's laughable, the idea that law enforcement or the military, the intelligence community is a bunch of deep state lefties. Deep state
Soros leftists.
Right, exactly. But we've spent 50 years trying to rebuild and protect the trust of the American people. That when we say we found something in a congressman's sock drawer, we found it there. And you can trust us because we're not on either team. Once you put on the uniform of a team, you lose that credibility. And when you stand up in front of a jury in Omaha or Seattle, or you knock on someone's door and say, if you tell me what's true, I will protect you, you can't be trusted anymore. And that's when you start to bleed out, because that trust courses through the veins of our justice system.
Yeah, I think I think that as an institutional force, the idea that, and it has taken root on the right, it really worries me. The idea that the FBI, first off, the imagination that the FBI is only targeting Trump and the Republicans is ludicrous. And the second part of it is this idea that the FBI is almost solely involved in these political things. It's a much broader organization than that does a lot of stuff on the front lines of counterintelligence and counterterrorism and all these other things. I find that idea that they're going to politicize it and burn down the institution in both the FBI and the DOJ more broadly. It rings an alarm bell with me. I know it's not the same with a lot of people out in the political sphere, but man, I just think the risks of it are just enormous.
It's short-sighted, like so many of the things that those who've surrendered to the cult of Trump have done. Again, you can't. Anyone who knows the Bureau knows that they're lying. One of the challenges is the Bureau has a hard time speaking for itself because the nature of its work, like counterintelligence, like counterterrorism, most of it is work that the public isn't supposed to ever see because it's about protecting before threats manifest themselves. But they know they're lying, and it's some of the most cynical things you could imagine. I felt it in 13, 14, 15 when I would appear in front of, especially on the House side, which Bob Mueller once said, like the bar scene in Star Wars. You would sit there and people would say things about the FBI that they knew were not true. Right. And now any restraint that was shown back 10 years ago is totally gone now.
Yeah, it's a wild and strange world these days. So, Director, I appreciate you coming on the show today. I wish you all the best, folks. The book is Westport by James Comey. It is terrific. Like I said, read it in a sitting over the weekend and really enjoyed it. It's a great mystery. And again, Director, I appreciate you coming on and being so candid about all the things that you've seen and that are facing the country as we go forward. And I wish you all the best on the book. It comes out on May 21st. That would be tomorrow from this recording. And wish you all the best and look forward to talking to you again soon.
You too. Thanks very much. Thanks for your voice. Keep talking.
Thank you. Appreciate it.